Greetings everyone and welcome to this IHS Country Risk webcast. I'm Paul McGrath, a director in the Country Risk team, and I'll be your chairperson for today. We're using a slightly different format to what some of you will be used to today, moving away from the slides-based briefing we traditionally use in favour of a less formal panel-style discussion with just a few slides for covering some of the issues. Today we're talking about North Korea. As you all know, we had a series of North Korean ballistic missile tests and a spiral of escalatory language adopted by Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un and US President Donald Trump, which have increased the potential for miscalculation leading to unintended escalation towards interstate war, including nuclear war. So our panel today will examine indicators and implications of conflict scenarios on the Korean Peninsula.
In July, North Korea carried out 2 tests of intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. In response to this, the US deployed B-1B Lancer strategic bombers to Guam and carried out its own operational test of a Minuteman III ICBM. Following that, on the 8th of August, Trump said that if North Korea were to continue threatening the United States, it would face unprecedented fire and fury. The next day, North Korean media said that Korean People's Army, or KPA, officials were carefully examining a contingency plan to contain US military bases on Guam. The important thing there was that the threat was specific, which is unusual for North Korea. They said that they would use 4 Hwasong-12 intermediate-range ballistic missiles fired over Japan and landing 30 to 40 kilometers away from Guam. Then last week on the 15th, North Korea's Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un said that he would watch to see how the US proceeded before acting on the KPA plan. Now this is in keeping with North Korea's past pattern of face-saving de-escalatory messaging. Lastly today, the US and South Korea began 10 days of routine joint military exercises, which North Korea regularly protests against through its media, but also in the past by firing artillery and last year, for the first time, mediate-range ballistic missiles.
Secretary of State Tillerson said in March that there was an end to the US's policy of, quote, strategic patience. But what does this actually mean, and how does this impact war risks with North Korea?
I think, Paul, it was and is important that regardless of any escalatory rhetoric used by the President, senior US officials, including Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, said that, first of all, the US has no interest in regime change in North Korea, and second, that the US is willing to negotiate. In practice, since January, the Trump administration's policy has not substantially differed from the Obama administration's strategic patience. However, increased unpredictability around US intentions or red lines could undermine its alliance relationship with South Korea, and more importantly, feeds into a new normal assessment. In short, this scenario looks like regular and irregular periods of heightened tension, but with increased likelihood of miscalculation and a risk of escalation towards conflict because of uncertainty, fewer channels of communication, and more frequent weapons demonstrations.
Okay, let's bring you in, Carl. So we've had conflicting reports of North Korea's nuclear and missile capabilities. Can you provide us with some clarity?
Short-range capability is based on liquid-fueled Scud technology, which has been gradually modified to increase the range of North Korea's strike force. The trade-off with this system and this technology, however, is one between distance and payload. So the more distance in general, the less payload we see. In addition to this, we see the movement towards other missile types, solid fuel missiles, for example, at land and sea, and multi-stage weapons, as seen through the Hwasong-14. These have different engine configurations from the Scud-based weapons and represent a step change. North Korea probably can put nuclear warheads onto their missiles. This is a fundamental part of engineering design, both for the nuclear physics package and the missile re-entry vehicle itself. As to which missile systems have nuclear weapons, it's too soon to say. The other day, Tae Yong-ho, the former North Korean diplomat who defected to the South, claimed the North was seeking to put nuclear warheads on all of its missiles.
What about anti-missile defences? So what have we got deployed in the areas which are within, certainly the current and projected range of North Korean missiles? with that in mind, kind of which countries are perhaps most vulnerable? I know we've seen the Israeli Iron Dome system work pretty well, but what have we got in the region, and how well do we think they would protect them?
Yeah, so unsurprisingly, missile defences have been adopted by Japan, South Korea and the United States. China also has a regional ballistic missile defense capability, but probably best to focus on Japan, South Korea and the United States in this scenario. Japan has two main systems. They work together as an upper and a lower tier. So the Patriot PAC-3 interceptor is used for point defense and forms the lower tier. Complementing this, Japan also has 6 ships equipped with the Aegis missile defense system, and this uses the SM-3 interceptor with a stated 700-kilometer range. South Korea also has 3 Aegis-equipped destroyers, but these use the older SM-2 interceptors. It's worth noting South Korea has a very ambitious missile defense system. This includes its own indigenous system, the Korean Air Missile Defense System, so KAMDS. The US has Aegis on its ships, and it also has the GMD, the Ground-Based Mid-Course Defense System, which is based in Alaska.
What do we think actually are the red lines for things to escalate beyond what we're used to seeing and what we've been seeing in current weeks?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that North Korea's specific threat towards Guam said that the missiles would land over 30 kilometers away from Guam, and that's probably because striking the island or indeed any other military asset would be a red line for the US, almost certain to draw it into conflict. On the other hand, proclamations last week in North Korea's national media were particularly interesting because they explicitly reiterated North Korea's red lines. They included a decapitation operation to take out North Korea's leadership. They also included a preventative war, which was mentioned by US National Security Advisor Lieutenant H.R. McMaster. Also, North Korea mentioned a preemptive attack, especially on its nuclear or missile facilities. And lastly, any kind of special operations designed to destabilize the government or North Korean society.
But North Korea will have gamed this scenario intensively. It has an entire department devoted to South Korean interactions within its intelligence apparatus, the United Front Department. North Korea will have thought about this extensively. We shouldn't see it as an irrational actor, but what it's done, it's choosing a brinkmanship scenario in order to maximize its effect. And because of this, it's likely to have planned a number of options for escalation, but also de-escalation, depending on what the US and South Korea do.
The key player in all of this is potentially China, but how much influence does China have here, and how do we think it'll handle the hardening positions of both the US and North Korea?
Well, China has substantial influence, mainly economic influence, over North Korea. I think it's important to note that changes in diplomatic ties and political influence since Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un came to power in North Korea in December 2011 mean that China does not have the same kind of influence politically that it had 5 to 10 years ago. For example, since Kim Jong-un came to power, there's been a sidelining of influential businessmen and political leaders in North Korea with strong ties to China, including, for example, his uncle Jang Song-taek in 2012. I think China's been clear and consistent over the years about its position, in short, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and multilateral talks to sort of solve this problem.
So it's obviously very difficult to gauge what's going on within the North Korean political and military leadership. But to the extent that we can, what do we know?
The two main takeaways are a consolidation. So there are fewer people in the top positions in 2016, and also that the party is increasingly dominant relative to the military. But this increase in party dominance, contrary to what you might expect, doesn't mean that there's been a softening of North Korea's national security stance, but actually many of these party members are part of the old guard and are relatively hawkish. So there's been an acceleration of development and demonstration of North Korea's advanced weapons.
Do we just have to learn to live with the fact that North Korea is now nuclear armed? Is it too late for any sanctions against the weapons program to have any impact, or any parallels to be drawn from the Iran situation?
Personally, I think it's time we learn to live with a nuclear North Korea. I don't think the Iran deal is particularly useful in this scenario, mainly because I think the negotiations for Iran were seen as lessons learned from failed diplomacy in North Korea. I don't think sanctions will contain North Korea. I think firstly, unlike Iran, North Korea already has nuclear weapons, whereas Iran never actually had them. And what we see with North Korea is very much tying of nuclear weapons into regime survival and regime legitimacy.
What about looking forward? What are the crucial next milestones we should be watching for?
So in terms of next steps, I think we're probably going to see more incremental testing. We've seen North Korea a little bit hampered by its geography, and it does lofted trajectory tests, so at a steeper angle, to avoid hitting Japan. We might see these, we might see them going over Japan, and we might see more testing, perhaps to demonstrate a viable re-entry vehicle. As ever with North Korea's propaganda machine, we're probably going to see more images of missiles and nuclear technology.
In the next 6 to 12 months, what are the most likely actual risks to assets, personnel, supply chains on the Korean Peninsula and beyond?
Well, I think the bottom line is that risks to aviation, marine and ground cargo assets, and indeed to individuals on the Korean Peninsula remains relatively low compared to other regions. We still think that conflict on the Korean Peninsula is an unlikely scenario, and over the past 10 years there's been no examples of cargo vessels or civilian aircraft affected by North Korean missiles or other weapons. However, low-level violent incidents still occur a few times a year, and it's the risks around these that have increased. They usually involve South Korean fishing or patrol vessels in the West Sea, or, for example, small arms fire across the demilitarized zone. And indeed, now I'd also include North Korea's ballistic missile tests into this group. It's been South Korean and, importantly, US restraint that has prevented these low-level violent incidents from escalating towards conflict.
So, many thanks to all our speakers and to all participants today. Many thanks for joining us.